There have been a great number of artists and musicians covered on this channel spanning several different genres, from hardcore to underground experimental hip-hop, but aside from the harsh noise iceberg, I've never really covered noise or harsh noise as much as I would like, being involved in and contributing to the very same genre. There's just something about noise music that is equal parts fascinating on an emotional and analytical level, with several releases over the course of the genre's nearly century-long lifetime. Tonight we will be discussing a series of noise albums from one of my favorite bands of all time that has inspired a lot of my own project. These are the sounds of Full of Hell's Noise series. For those unaware, Full of Hell is an American grindcore band from Ocean City, Maryland, whose music spans several years and several different genres in extreme music, starting out as an evil-sounding hardcore/power violence band, and eventually moving towards more elements of grindcore and death metal through multiple releases, EPs, splits, and collaboration albums with other bands such as The Body and Merzbow. Full of Hell's music has always retained one key element throughout their decade as a band, and that's noise. Full of Hell's music is noisy, abrasive, misanthropic, and harsh, often mixing elements of noise and power electronics into their main albums, as well as the multiple splits and collaborative albums mentioned before, with members of Full of Hell even having their own noise projects, and guitarist Spencer Hazard even making his own noise devices and instruments. One of which I have is known as the Death Grinder, which is actually my second Death Grinder since I pretty much broke the other one using it all the time. With that being said, it makes sense that with the members being heavily influenced and involved in the noise genre, they would have their own set of noise tapes to listen to. Full of Hell Noise Volume 1 is the first EP in a series of noise tapes released by Full of Hell on January 1st, 2011. The cover features the infamous image of Have You Seen This Man?, an internet mystery and urban legend regarding reports of several people seeing a mysterious man in their dreams without having any recollection of seeing him anywhere else. The EP contains 4 songs in total, with the runtime spanning about 19 minutes in length. This release marks a good starting point for both casual Full of Hell fans and casual noise fans in general who are more curious about the genre. The EP features a heavy Merzbow influence, with some more power electronics and death industrial elements thrown in, similar to projects like White House or Death Pile. The first track, There Is a Beginning, is a fitting opener. A dark, ominous drone carries the track as various electronic sounds fill in the spaces. Static slowly starts to creep in, feeling like the distant buzzing of insects. Spoken vocals begin as panicked breaths and pants start to play in the background, while Full of Hell vocalist Dylan Walker recounts that there's a hole where his eyes and heart used to be. This section continues for a few moments, before more unclean vocals start to take over, similar to the band's main work. I really like this track as an introduction to the tape. The drones and textures, while simple, are layered really well, serving as this sort of calm before the storm, as the rest of the tape is a heavier onslaught of noise and power electronics. The unclean vocals on this track remind me a lot of something on GR, and I dig that the main drones and noise glitch out and become more present during this section, almost like a machine dying, crying out as it screams its last breath. The EP is much more of an ambient noise experience, but still offers some pretty harsh moments. The track A Dream is this wave of emotion and sound, crashing into each other as it all washes over the listener, as the vocal work on this project only ramps up more and more, becoming more pained and angry at a steady pace. After the release of Full of Hell Noise Volume 1, another entry in the band's foray into complete noise was released only a few months after, in August of 2011. Full of Hell Noise Volume 2 is the shortest of the 4 EPs, only being just a little under 10 minutes and featuring 2 tracks. However, Full of Hell Noise Volume 2 wastes little time in completely throwing you into its hellish sounds, being more aggressive than the first entry but still building off the elements and concept of the first tape. Volume 2 is a more pissed off, chaotic experience in my opinion. The opening track, Deafening Echoes, is a multi-layered power electronics track. Much like the beginning of the first volume, Full of Hell opens up with some nice spoken word passages as ethereal drones warble in the background. The track also features some pretty crazy unclean vocals, which I like a lot more on here than on the previous volume. The second track, A Vacant Dwelling, is way more of a standard noise track and is pretty alright. Nothing too crazy of note here, but it does remind me of a lot of old school industrial noise tracks with the metal clangs, scrapes, feedback loops, and distorted screams. Overall, Overall, it's a nice release that, while short, doesn't overstay its welcome and still offers a lot of cool sounds and textures that continue to build off of the sound of the first volume. Full of Hell Noise Volume 3 has to be one of my favorites out of all the Noise EPs that the band has put out so far. Released in June of 2012, the EP features some of the sickest soundscapes and concepts out of the series and is all around pretty killer from beginning to end. The opener, Dead Mudlark and Thames, features a dense, creeping, atmospheric experience, as sounds of humming quietly play over a low static interspersed with strange, guttural sounds and whimpers, almost incomprehensible to the human ears, almost like beastly sounds alien to anything I have ever heard mixed with warbled crying. It's a great intro track and one of the best in the series. Output 1-26 is a track more akin to what we've heard on previous entries, but still keeping that eerie atmosphere as the previous track. Not outright harsh noise, but I kinda dig the quieter, more ambient approach that the band has had in the series, offering a lot of unique textures and sounds on every release, only being harsh when it needs to be, but still feeling confrontational all the way through. Where Full of Hell really hits it hard with this EP though is the ending track, which is a grindy, noisy, hardcore adjacent cover of Atmosphere by Joy Division, a deeply suffocating track with pummeling drums and distorted guitar work, while being more of a grindcore track on a primarily noise/dark ambient record. This manages to be a major highlight in the series, being a great cover while still offering the listener some noisy composition as vocalist Dylan Walker angrily screams the lyrics in this now iconic vocal style. The track is a hammer smashing against your skull, and its sinister composition and approach quickly made the volume one of my favorites in the series and one of my favorite songs by them in general. Full of Hell Noise Volume 4 is the final entry of the original quadrilogy of Full of Hell's series of EPs under the Noise label before the series' 7-year hiatus. Released in May of 2013, the EP is a very intriguing audio experience and another one of my favorites on an atmospheric level. While featuring a lot of the same elements that we have become familiar with over the course of the previous entries, Full of Hell still manages to produce a sonically interesting piece of noise with Volume 4. The ambient experimental aspects are most prevalent here, with more quiet, drony passages mixed in with some traditional noise parts that, while isn't the harshest project I've listened to and isn't Full of Hell at their noisiest, it's still a pretty cool listen that I would definitely recommend. Before getting into the last entry in Full of Hell's over decade-long noise series, there are a couple of pieces of noisy side content that should be covered, most notably the band's collaborations with legendary Japanese noise artist Merzbow. Now, Merzbow's extensive releases and catalog could take up several videos, but for those who don't know, Masami Akita, or better known by his project name Merzbow, is arguably one of the most prolific artists in the noise genre, with work spanning several decades, collaborations, and even genres. His most notable work is 1996's Pulse Demon, 1994's Venerology, and other releases like his many collabs with bands and projects like Boris, Shushu, Bastard Noise, and more. It's safe to say Merzbow may be arguably the most well-known noise artist, having many of his biggest works published through American extreme metal labels like Relapse Records. Also, fun fact for my goreheads out there, Merzbow's track I Lead You Towards Glorious Times appears in the soundtrack for Traces of Death 3, alongside bands like Mortician, Macabre, Meshuggah, and more, because Relapse Records also produced the soundtrack for the film. The track is, or at least was at the time, the loudest piece of music ever created in CD format as well. So with Merzbow being as prolific as he is, it would make sense that a collab between him and one of the noisiest acts in modern hardcore and metal would be bound to happen at some point. It is also worth mentioning that Full of Hell were already major fans of Akita's work prior to the collaborative releases, and a lot of what you hear in the noise releases draw very heavy inspirations from the work of Merzbow, with the walls of rolling static textures, metal clangs and clank, and a confrontational aggressiveness that is seen in many of Merzbow's releases. noise. The project came to be after a show in New York in which Full of Hell was opening for the grindcore band Phobia, where the band ran into Merzbow's live drummer Balazs Pondy. Pondy and Full of Hell kept in touch, sending each other albums to listen to, when eventually Pondy had become the band's indirect communication to Merzbow. After getting permission to do a Full of Hell shirt that paid tribute to Merzbow's 1996 release Pulse Demon, the band eventually began talks to collaborate musically with Masami Akita. Originally, Masami wanted to do a split album, but thought it would be better to collaborate on a full project instead. Full of Hell and Merzbow is the first release in this collaborative series, dropping on November 24th, 2014. The album features 11 tracks and stands at a little over 23 minutes long. The release is way more of a standard death grind release than the previous Full of Hell Noise series, being more akin to the mainline Full of Hell albums, but still offers a good deal of noisy elements that set it apart from those releases. The album is really solid in its delivery of experimentation and aggression, being 23 minutes of a non-stop barrage of skull pummeling, rib-kicking grindcore/hardcore. The opening track, Burst Synapse, opens right out the gate with fast-beating blast beats, insane guitars, and savagely delivered vocals. The album continues on with song after song of sheer chaos, never slowing down until about the end of the track, Blue Litmus, which features this really crazy, almost meltdown of noise, industrial sounds, and Dylan Walker's shrieking vocal work that sounds akin to something like a low-quality, raw black metal track. Full of Hell and Merzbow is an all-killer, no-filler album, as it really just never lets you go until the very end, giving the listener little to no time to collect their thoughts before being plunged into the next track of insanity. I do truly think that this is an underrated release in the band's ever-evolving discography, with the only thing I don't particularly enjoy about this release is the lack of Merzbow's influence on the project. It does become more apparent towards the end of the album, with some really good longer tracks like High Fells, Lujet Av Good, and more featuring a lot more prominent noise, but for the first half of the album it feels almost absent outside of a few moments that break away from the grindcore onslaught. The reason for this being is that Masami Akita had only provided Full of Hell with 45 minutes of total material to use however they saw fit, with further communication with Merzbow being minimal during the writing and recording process of the release. This caused Full of Hell to map out how the source material would be used across the album, which ultimately took over a year of working with the material. The finished project, as stated by Dylan Walker in an interview with Toby Cook of The Quietist, is that the album would be 70% Full of Hell and 30% Merzbow record, so much like a regular Full of Hell record with noise. Overall, I really enjoyed revisiting this release after hearing it for the first time so long ago, and if you like some really noisy experimental grindcore, I definitely recommend this release. However, within the CD version of Full of Hell and Merzbow lay another collaboration album between the two projects, released this time in the form of Sister Fawn, a sort of part 2/extended cut of the original release, this time with the percentages flipped, featuring more prominent elements of Merzbow's noise with Full of Hell interspersed in between. I enjoyed this part of the album a little bit more in my opinion, with it focusing more on noise and noisecore elements. Sister Fawn is also longer in length than the original album, sitting at around 35 minutes. The opening track, Ergo, is sick, featuring some super pounding drums overlaid with samples of Merzbow's noise. I really like the bellowing textures sounding like air raid sirens and boat horns as rolling waves of static and drums crash into each other, creating this almost chaotic apocalyptic sound. What I prefer over the first collaboration is that this is the way the noise is used and presented overall. Sister Fawn is very heavy, misanthropic, and raw, where Noiseheads may have felt the first LP was lacking. Sister Fawn definitely picks up in that regard while still feeling like a worthy companion piece / addition to Full of Hell and Merzbow. You see, while I had said that Full of Hell Noise Volume 4 was the final entry in the original series, 2020 saw the release of a 5th entry from the band via the Full of Hell Noise box set, a physical collection of the previous Full of Hell Noise releases on cassette. Full of Hell Noise Volume 5 is probably the most interesting out of all the tapes sound-wise. A lot of harsh textures all throughout, taking inspiration from several noise-adjacent genres like power electronics, death industrial, and even gore noise. Like, that was something I was not expecting at all when going into this tape were 2 short, harsh gore noise tracks, but that was a cool surprise, honestly. The tape itself is rather short aside from the first 2 tracks and the last one, but despite its short runtime, the tape still manages to deliver a pummeling experience that the series has become known for. When it comes to getting into noise music, it can be hard to find exactly where a good starting point is outside of the aforementioned projects discussed in this video. However, while I think that there are more interesting releases out there to delve into, it's not every day that a hardcore/metal band is as dedicated to noise as Full of Hell is. It is clear that they have a lot of love for the genre and are fans of the projects and bands that they are inspired by. The Full of Hell noise series serves as less of a definitive evolution of noise music and more of just a love letter to the genre. I think that a lot of people get caught up in how good noise music has to be, artificially putting boundaries on a genre that should have none. Full of Hell noise is not something that needed to push the boundaries of the genre, but rather just some good sounds, textures, and atmosphere that you can vibe to. This has been Yoshimi, and have a good night.